The 1980s may be remembered for neon lights, blockbuster heroes, and heartwarming family films, but lurking in the shadows were movies so violent they rattled censors, horrified critics, and terrified governments. Some were banned outright, others mutilated by cuts, and all became legends because of their brutality. Today we're peeling back the curtain on 13 80s movies so violent they got censored. A Clockwork Orange re-release in the 80s. Though originally released in 1971, A Clockwork Orange exploded back into controversy in the 1980s when it became widely available on VHS. Stanley Kubrick's dystopian tale of Alex DeLarge and his gang committing acts of ultra-violence to the sound of Beethoven was already infamous. But when home video brought it into living rooms, outrage hit a fever pitch. The British public associated the film with real-life crimes, claiming it inspired copycat attacks. Kubrick himself requested Warner Brothers to withdraw the film from circulation in the UK, effectively banning it there until after his death. This rare move only intensified the film's mystique. Censors in other countries also hacked away at its most shocking sequences, turning screenings into butchered shadows of Kubrick's original vision. Yet, banning it only made it more desirable. Bootleg VHS copies spread underground, especially among rebellious teenagers. For them, watching A Clockwork Orange wasn't just entertainment, it was an act of defiance. By the mid-1980s, it was a whispered legend, a movie people claimed to have seen even when they hadn't. What censors failed to realize was that Kubrick's film wasn't glorifying violence, but dissecting it, holding up a mirror to society's darkest impulses. In trying to suppress its message, authorities only amplified its myth. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Few films in history stirred the kind of moral panic that Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust did. Released at the dawn of the decade, it combined faux documentary realism with grotesque violence that made even seasoned horror fans nauseous. Framed as found footage from a missing film crew in the Amazon, its raw, handheld aesthetic blurred the line between fiction and reality. Authorities weren't just disturbed, they were convinced it was real. The violence looked so authentic that Deodato was arrested and charged with murder in Italy. He had to bring his actors into court, alive and well, to prove they hadn't actually been killed on camera. Though charges were dropped, the film was banned in more than 50 countries, from the UK to Australia, earning it a permanent spot on the infamous Video Nasties list. Animal cruelty in the film created further outrage. Several nations refused classification, meaning it couldn't be shown legally in theaters or sold on home video. Even heavily edited versions sparked boycotts. Critics condemned it as exploitation garbage, while defenders argued it was a savage critique of media, sensationalism, and colonial arrogance. In the 1980s, forbidden VHS tapes of Cannibal Holocaust were passed around like cursed relics, daring horror fans to stomach what censors couldn't bear to show. For many, it wasn't just a film, it was a test of endurance, a brutal initiation into the darkest corners of cinema. Its legacy today is divisive, but one thing remains certain: censorship didn't kill it, it immortalized it. The Evil Dead, 1981. When Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead burst onto the scene in 1981, it was hailed as both a low-budget miracle and a stomach-turning nightmare. Filmed on a shoestring budget in a remote Tennessee cabin, its relentless gore, demonic possessions, and manic energy shocked audiences. What made it different from other horror films of the era was its unapologetic brutality, captured with a handheld rawness that made the violence feel almost too real. In Britain, the film quickly found itself swept up in the video nasties panic. Authorities claimed its relentless dismemberments and blood-soaked mayhem were corrupting the youth. Prosecutors even dragged rental shop owners into court for carrying copies. The result was censorship. Multiple versions were cut with scenes of flesh tearing and chainsaw carnage trimmed or excised entirely. In Germany, the film was outright banned, forcing fans to hunt down bootleg tapes. Ironically, censorship only helped The Evil Dead achieve cult status. Its very unavailability made it legendary among horror fans. Bruce Campbell's chainsaw-wielding, blood-drenched Ash became an icon, and the film's reputation grew with every whispered story about how much footage had been cut. Raimi himself leaned into the controversy, calling it the ultimate experience in grueling terror. Looking back, The Evil Dead is both a testament to indie filmmaking and a symbol of how censorship can amplify a film's legacy. What began as a scrappy horror flick turned into one of the most infamous titles of the decade precisely because it was deemed too dangerous to see. Scarface, 1983. When Brian De Palma remade Scarface in 1983, he didn't just update a gangster classic. He pushed the boundaries of screen violence to new extremes. Al Pacino's portrayal of Tony Montana, a Cuban refugee clawing his way to the top of Miami's drug empire, was explosive, foul-mouthed, and drenched in blood. The infamous chainsaw scene where a rival is dismembered in a hotel bathroom became one of the most controversial sequences of the decade. The MPAA originally slapped the film with an X rating, effectively banning it from mainstream theaters. De Palma was forced to cut and resubmit the film multiple times. Even then, critics blasted it for glorifying excess, calling it depraved and an assault on taste. In some countries, censors demanded heavy edits. In Britain and Australia, broadcasts trimmed out much of the drug use and bloodshed. But audiences disagreed with the censors. Fans embraced Scarface as both a cautionary tale and a larger-than-life epic. Its violence wasn't just spectacle, it was the language of ambition and destruction in the cocaine-fueled 1980s. By the time Tony Montana unloaded his machine gun in the film's climactic final act, he wasn't just a gangster. He was a symbol of America's obsession with power, wealth, and downfall. Ironically, the censorship only fed its myth. Bootleg VHS copies of the uncut version spread quickly, making it a cult classic long before critics reappraised it. Today, Scarface is considered one of the greatest crime films ever made, but in the 1980s it was so violent it was nearly buried alive. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2, 1986. Tobe Hooper's original Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974 shocked audiences with its grim, documentary-like realism. When he returned over a decade later with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, fans expected more of the same. What they got was something darker, stranger, and far more grotesque. Unlike the first film's subtle terror, the sequel was drenched in graphic violence and black comedy, pushing censorship boards to their limits. Leatherface returned, chainsaw roaring, but this time the gore was explicit. Scalping, dismemberment, and buckets of blood splattered across the screen. The MPAA nearly banned it, forcing Hooper to make multiple cuts just to avoid an X rating. Even then, many theaters refused to show it. In the UK, censors slashed several minutes, and the film joined the growing list of titles targeted during the video nasties hysteria. Critics were divided. Some saw it as grotesque parody, a bloody satire of Reagan-era consumerism and horror itself. Others dismissed it as exploitation garbage, little more than a gore fest riding on the original's reputation. Yet for fans, its outrageous violence and dark humor made it unforgettable. Dennis Hopper's wild-eyed performance as a chainsaw-wielding lawman hunting Leatherface only added to its notoriety. While the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 may not have been celebrated in its own time, censorship transformed it into a cult classic. Its grotesque violence, once seen as its downfall, eventually became the very reason it endured. Proof that in the 1980s, censorship often only fueled a film's legend. Robocop, 1987, Paul Verhoeven's Robocop, was marketed as a sci-fi action blockbuster, but when audiences sat down in 1987, they were met with something far more shocking. A film so violent that censors went into overdrive. The story of a slain Detroit cop resurrected as a cyborg law enforcer became a brutal satire of corporate greed, crime, and media excess. Yet it was the way it depicted violence that triggered outrage. The infamous execution scene where Officer Murphy is blown apart by gangsters in a hail of bullets pushed audiences to their limits. Test screenings had viewers fainting or walking out, and the MPAA initially branded it with an X rating. To secure an R rating, Verhoeven was forced to trim sequences of graphic dismemberment and prolonged bloodshed. Even then, many international versions were heavily cut, with TV broadcasts censoring nearly every moment of gore. But beneath the carnage, Robocop was biting social commentary. Its exaggerated violence was deliberately absurd, mocking the desensitization of a society drowning in commercials, corporate takeovers, and endless news cycles. Censors, however, largely ignored its satire, focusing only on its blood and brutality. Ironically, censorship only fueled its reputation. Fans clamored for uncut VHS and Laserdisc editions, and the uncensored director's cut eventually became a prized collector's item. By amplifying its notoriety, the censors transformed Robocop from a mere sci-fi hit into a cultural icon. Today, it's remembered not just for its violence, but for daring to ask whether humanity could survive under the machine of consumerism. Friday the 13th, 1980. When Friday the 13th debuted in 1980, it was dismissed by critics as little more than a Halloween knockoff. But audiences disagreed, turning it into one of the most successful slasher franchises ever. What shocked censors was its unapologetic brutality. The film's inventive kills, arrows through throats, axes to heads, and machetes slicing flesh, were unlike anything mainstream cinema had dared before. Tom Savini's groundbreaking makeup effects made the violence disturbingly realistic. So realistic, in fact, that the MPAA demanded heavy cuts before release. Scenes like Kevin Bacon's harrowing death, an arrow driven up through his throat, had to be trimmed down to mere flashes. International censors were even harsher. The UK cut several kills entirely, while some European countries banned the film on video. Critics blasted it as sick, accusing it of glorifying violence against teenagers. But audiences lined up anyway, proving that controversy was often the best marketing tool. Parents' groups campaigned against the franchise, claiming it desensitized youth, but their outrage only made Jason Voorhees and his hockey mask even more iconic. In the end, Friday the 13th changed horror forever. Its censored violence gave birth to a formula: creative kills, relentless pace, and teenagers paying the ultimate price that defined the slasher era. What began as a low-budget gamble became a cultural juggernaut, surviving precisely because censors tried and failed to silence it. The Untouchables, 1987, Brian De Palma's The Untouchables was marketed as a stylish gangster epic about Elliot Ness's battle against Al Capone. Audiences expected a slick period drama, but what they got was a film drenched in operatic violence. The baseball bat scene, where Robert De Niro's Capone smashes a man's skull at a dinner table, remains one of the most shocking depictions of brutality in a mainstream studio film. The violence didn't stop there. Shootouts erupted with blood spraying across marble floors, and De Palma's homage to Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, the train station baby carriage sequence, turned into an unforgettable ballet of bullets and bodies. Critics were divided. Some praised its artistry, others condemned it for glamorizing bloodshed. Censors took notice. International boards in Germany and Australia trimmed violent sequences, especially the bat scene. Television versions heavily censored shootouts, removing blood squibs and cutting away from close-ups. Even the MPAA pushed back, forcing De Palma to tone down certain edits to avoid the dreaded X rating. And yet, audiences couldn't look away. The film became a box office hit, earning critical acclaim and an Academy Award for Sean Connery. Its violence, far from diminishing its impact, gave it a mythic quality. By the time the credits rolled, it was clear The Untouchables wasn't just a gangster tale, it was a brutal reminder that violence, when wielded by power, always comes at a cost. The Terminator, 1984. When James Cameron unleashed the Terminator in 1984, few expected it to become a cultural juggernaut. Marketed as a low-budget sci-fi thriller, it shocked audiences with its relentless violence and cold, mechanical brutality. Arnold Schwarzenegger's portrayal of the cybernetic assassin was chilling not just for his size and presence, but for the film's merciless execution of its victims. The police station massacre, where the Terminator guns downed dozens of officers in cold blood, pushed censors into a frenzy. The MPAA initially considered an X rating due to the sheer body count and graphic gunshot wounds. Cuts were made, but even the R-rated version rattled parents' groups. International censors in Scandinavia and parts of Asia trimmed entire sequences of carnage, but the controversy only amplified its legend. Schwarzenegger's emotionless killing machine terrified and fascinated viewers. Unlike other 80s action films, the violence here wasn't cartoonish. It was cold, efficient, and unstoppable. Critics who dismissed it as cheap exploitation soon realized they were witnessing the birth of a sci-fi classic. Censorship boards may have tried to reduce its sting, but the film's haunting message survived. Technology, when stripped of morality, becomes the most ruthless killer of all. In trying to suppress its violence, censors only reinforced its reputation as one of the most dangerous and essential films of the decade. Hellraiser, 1987. Clive Barker's Hellraiser wasn't just a horror movie, it was a nightmare torn from the depths of imagination. Based on Barker's novella The Hellbound Heart, it introduced audiences to the Cenobites, otherworldly beings who explored the limits of pain and pleasure. With its grisly special effects and relentless body horror, the film became one of the most censored of the decade. Scenes of flesh being ripped apart by hooks, skinless bodies, staggering through rooms, and grotesque transformations tested the limits of censors worldwide. The MPAA initially balked, demanding extensive cuts. The UK Board of Film Classification heavily edited gore for video release, while some countries banned it outright. Even the advertising campaign faced backlash for its disturbing imagery. But beneath its gore, Hellraiser was more than shock. It was a meditation on desire, obsession, and the price of temptation. That nuance was lost on most censorship boards, which saw only mutilation. Audiences, however, embraced it, and Pinhead became a horror icon, his calm menace unforgettable. The irony is clear. The very violence that censors tried to suppress was what made Hellraiser unique. It wasn't just blood for shock value, it was a visual language that gave form to human obsession and suffering. By cutting it down, censors failed to see the artistry within the nightmare. The 1980s gave us stories that dared to bleed on screen, testing the limits of what cinema could show and what society could stomach. Some were banned, others butchered, but all survived to become legends. Which of these violent classics do you remember? Comment below, like and subscribe for more hidden histories of film.